now for the opposition's reaction to the bill. We are joined by Don Davies. He's the official opposition's immigration critic, the NDP, of course, and from the Liberals is Sean Casey, the associate justice critic. Thanks for joining me. To you first, Mr. Davies, your biggest, I heard your press conference, a litany of problems with this bill, but what is the main concern you have with this?
Well, the main concern is that when you talk about human smuggling and human trafficking, any fine, sound policy, we think, should be directed at the traffickers and the smugglers. This bill completely misses the mark. It targets the refugees, who are very often the victims of the smuggling. And I think that is the fundamental flaw in this bill. You know, by allowing the minister to designate refugees as irregular entrance at his fiat, and then jail those people for 12 months without review, including children, as a means of trying to discourage people around the world from fleeing persecution.
He called it actually reducing a price point, though, not just fleeing persecution. He was saying $50,000 is what it often costs for these smugglers, or these people to come in.
I heard that, and I have to say I think that's a rather perverse approach. I mean, to use marketing in economic terms to determine economic policy. I mean, people that are fleeing persecution, whether it's a war zone or child rape or child soldiering or whatever, often will have to pay money to someone in order to flee. Often they'll have to leave by boat. That doesn't necessarily make them criminals. It doesn't make the people who help them criminals. It makes them refugees. And this bill makes no distinction between those kind of people and true human traffickers or human smugglers who are trafficking people, say, for the sex trade or for massive profits. And I think locking people up to discourage people around the world from fleeing persecution is not fair, and I don't think it's going to be effective.
Mr. Casey, your take on this, because one of the issues is that it won't pass the charter test. Mr. Kenney sat here and said that they think it will, and they'll leave that to the judges to decide. What did the Liberals say about that?
Well, a very bright man said earlier today that if the only implement in your toolbox is a sledgehammer, everything starts to look like a rock.
Now, who would that be? Bob Ray, your leader, I think, said it. Was it? Yeah.
A very brilliant man.
Okay.
And I absolutely agree that the prospects of a successful charter challenge in this case is significant. I mean, talk about the denial of life, liberty, and security of the person, and whether or not that's a reasonable limit in a free and democratic society. I mean, your gut instantly tells you that it isn't going to pass that. So I would be very surprised if there isn't a charter challenge, and I'd be very surprised if it doesn't succeed. We believe that the legislation will likely be found to be unconstitutional.
Well, then, so what's the point? I mean, because presumably the bureaucrats are telling Mr. Kenney and his people and Mr. Davies, the public safety minister, that this will not pass. So it's a waste of time. Is it just for the core? Is it just for the Conservative core, the base?
I think it's because of optics. You know, when the first boat landed on the shores of British Columbia 2 years ago, the Ocean Lady, this government prepared legislation within 2 months. I mean, that's very quick. So I think this is about optics and about looking like they're doing something instead of considered, thoughtful immigration policy. There's a precedent to the Charter Challenge. The mandatory detention without review process in the security certificate regime was challenged and struck down by the Supreme Court of Canada. So we have a precedent for this. This is a similar kind of thing where they can designate people and lock them up for 12 months without any review. And again, that involves children, if you can imagine. Even after that, if you're successfully determined to be a refugee, this legislation says that you can't sponsor your spouse or children for 5 years after that. That's probably a violation of Section 31 of the Refugee Convention. There's legal problems all over the bill, all over this bill. And I would have hoped that this government would have learned from a lot of the critiques and analysis done by many groups in this country, including NGOs and church groups and immigration lawyers, who went through this bill with a fine-tooth comb and pointed out the problems. And this government simply came forward and reintroduced the same bill.
Right, yeah. And Mr. Casey, Jason Kenney said this is a priority of the government. This after the budget. This is their big priority. During the election campaign in Prince Edward Island, where the province you represent, did you hear a lot about this? Were people really concerned about human smuggling?
Not a once.
Well, he says he's telling us that this is a huge concern of Canadians.
We heard a lot about the politics of fear. We heard a lot about the trustworthiness of the government. I heard nothing about human smuggling. It is not an issue on the streets of Charlottetown.
Do you think it's an issue anywhere else? I mean, obviously you heard about it in BC, Mr. Davies. You're of course from British Columbia, and where the ships have come in.
Well, I think it's fair to say that it's a concern, but we have to put it in perspective. We had one ship had 78 people. One ship had 480 people. I think people would have to think back a long time before they could think of another ship that had people in it. So we're talking, several hundred people in a country of 34 million, in decades. And it was a very unique situation. These were Tamils who were fleeing a very, very brutal civil war. And I think that it's understandable that some of those people would land on our shores. Every day in this country, refugees get off airplanes in airports in every city of this country, and they make refugee claims. Coming by ship is rarer because of where we're geographically situated, but it does happen. So I think to go to such draconian steps as this, to really talk about locking people up, as Sean said, depriving people of their liberty, to deal with what is a relatively small problem is wrong. Look, human smuggling as well, there's a way to deal with it. We should be increasing our police forces internationally to work to go after the real smugglers, not the refugees, and we should be beefing up our processing time for bona fide refugees to get them here quicker so that there's less incentive for those refugees to maybe take matters in their own hands.
On that note, I've got to wrap it up. I want to thank you gentlemen for joining us. Sean Casey, Don Davies, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jane.
Pleasure. Thank you.